talk. So today we are going to talk about hypothyroidism. And this is a very popular topic because hypothyroidism is very pervasive amongst many people, but also the symptoms of hypothyroidism are pervasive. So we're going to talk about what hypothyroidism is, how it clinically manifests, the most common patterns, or I should say the 4 patterns of hypothyroidism, why testing is so important, and some of the tools that you can use to test and also restore your thyroid. Okay, so starting off, I'm a huge believer that if you understand normal, identifying dysfunction becomes much easier, and in my opinion, education is power. So to start, I'm going to start off by describing what the thyroid is and how it works. So the thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland that sits at the base of your throat. It influences many aspects of our health and well-being. So to give you an idea, every single cell in the body has a receptor for thyroid hormone. The thyroid can influence our body temperature, our metabolic rate, our ability to synthesize and build muscle. It influences immune system activity. It influences brain neurochemicals. So if we feel happy, sad, stressed, anxious, it influences DNA synthesis. It influences many, many factors of health, which is also why when the thyroid goes out or there's true hypothyroidism or euthyroidism, which I'll explain in just a minute, the symptoms can be all over the place. We can feel it everywhere. So now let's talk about what the thyroid is and how it works. The thyroid, basic physiology, the thyroid produces 2 main hormones, T3 and T4. They have long names, so I'm just going to leave it simple, T3 and T4. The brain, the pituitary specifically, is constantly, the pituitary is considered like the master endocrine hormone, or I'm sorry, the master endocrine gland. So it's constantly regulating other glands in the body, like the adrenal glands and the ovaries and the testes and pancreas to organize or really control hormone levels in the body. So the pituitary is constantly sensing the amount of thyroid hormone that's in the blood. And it releases a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, to the thyroid in response to those levels. So if there's low levels of thyroid hormone in the blood, the pituitary will release TSH to the thyroid, to basically telling it to do its job and produce more of the hormones. If the pituitary is sensing high levels of thyroid hormone in the blood, then it will produce less thyroid stimulating hormone, essentially telling the thyroid like, hey, calm down, we don't need any more of the hormone. In response to TSH, the thyroid produces then its 2 main hormones, T3 and T4. The thyroid produces 93% T4 and only about 7% T3. T4 is an inactive hormone. It doesn't do anything essentially on its own. It has to be converted into T3. T3 is the hormone that does work in the body. The reason for this is because different body tissues are going to need different amounts of thyroid hormone at any given time. So the heart is going to need more than the brain, it's going to need less than the skeletal muscle, it's going to need more than the digestive tract. You get the idea. And so it's impossible for the thyroid itself to control all of those levels. So rather, body tissues, everything from the spleen to the gastrointestinal system to skeletal muscle, the liver, the kidneys, they convert T4 into T3, where then other body tissues can use it at the rate that it needs to. And from there, the hormone T3 binds to a receptor on the cell, which initiates this cascade of events where that hormone then affects our DNA. And when it affects the DNA, that's when the changes occur. We feel something, changes within the tissue occur. And that's basic thyroid physiology 101. So now let's talk about the 4 most common patterns of breakdown. And I'll say these aren't necessarily patterns, I'm saying they're functions. I guess you could call them patterns. But one thing that I want to mention first is When doctors test thyroid, 90% of the time they're only going to test TSH, which now we can appreciate is technically a pituitary hormone. But nonetheless, they're only 90% of the time they're only going to test TSH. And if TSH comes back within an already exorbitantly broad lab reference range, you're going to be diagnosed as normal and that you don't have a thyroid problem. However, that test gives us a fraction, literally about 1/10 of the information that we need to truly assess the thyroid. In addition, as I mentioned, the lab reference ranges are very broad. So the common lab reference range is, I believe, 0.45 to 5.4, 4.5, it's something like that. It's very broad. And that's because lab reference ranges are screening for disease. So ironically, it's not like every lab in the nation is running off of the same reference ranges. Actually, each individual lab has their own set of reference ranges. And that's because those reference ranges are determined by that lab averaging together the results for the population of people that they see in a given year. So these ranges change annually. They then place those results on a bell-shaped curve to generate a low end and a high end, and that's where we get the reference range. So it's based on the average of population of people that they see. And we can deduce that's kind of a skewed control group because it's typically not, people that feel really well that are getting their blood drawn on a routine basis. In addition, lab reference ranges are screening for disease, so they're broad in nature. So therefore, the point that I'm making is even if just TSH alone is run, oftentimes that will be well outside of what I would consider the optimal range. The range I use is 1.8 to 3.0. And the ranges we use we meaning functional practitioners, are determined by medical researchers studying healthy populations to determine what optimal is. Okay, so just from that alone, you can understand how a lot of people fall through the cracks when it comes to diagnosing hypothyroidism. Next, from a lab testing perspective, sometimes doctors will test T3 and T4, the hormones themselves. It gives us a better idea, but not the full amount of information. When I'm assessing the thyroid, I look at 11 different markers, and here's why. When we look at patterns of breakdown, we need to look at 4 main things. 4 places where the thyroid can break down, and I'll explain why I do that in just a minute. So one pattern, the first pattern, is true hypothyroidism. And in true hypothyroidism, that means that for whatever reason, the thyroid itself truly is not producing enough T4 or T3. Generally, it's T4 since T3 has to be converted anyways. Okay, there can be many reasons for this. It can be high estrogen levels. It can be toxicity. It could be nutrient deficiencies like iodine, selenium, zinc, vegan diets lacking tyrosine. It can be stress. So there can be multiple different reasons as to why the thyroid's not producing its hormone, all of which need to be uncovered. Medication's not the long-term solution. But nonetheless, that's pattern number 1. True primary is what it's called, primary hypothyroidism. Thyroid itself not doing its job. Second pattern is, and this is actually most common, 90% of primary hypothyroid cases are actually what we call Hashimoto's thyroiditis. They're autoimmune in nature. So what this means is the immune system is attacking the thyroid, thereby preventing the thyroid, obviously, from releasing its hormones. This creates hypothyroidism. However, the problem is not with the thyroid itself, it's with the immune system. The thyroid is just an innocent bystander. It's worth mentioning, like I said, truly 90% of primary hypothyroid cases are autoimmune in nature, though insurance still won't always cover testing the antibodies. So many people go undiagnosed with Hashimoto's. Secondly, 2 completely different approaches as far as restoring health goes. One, we need to figure out what's causing the thyroid to be underactive. The second one, we need to work with the immune system and figure out why it's becoming dysfunctional so that we can save the thyroid. 2 different approaches. Another thing that's worth mentioning, some of the common symptoms of Hashimoto's, like hallmark symptoms. One is fluctuation between hypo and hyperthyroid symptoms. So you might go from feeling depressed to anxious, constipated to diarrhea, weight loss, weight gain, insomnia, to and just constant low energy, to like an internal tremor feeling. So the symptoms often alternate, and medication levels are constantly having to be adjusted because there's varying levels of thyroid hormone that are in the blood due to the destruction of the thyroid. The third pattern actually looks at conversion issues. So the thyroid's producing T4 okay, but T4 is not being converted into T3 appropriately, thereby mimicking hypothyroidism, even though most lab tests are going to come back normal when it's just those 3 tests that are run. And then the fourth pattern is the thyroid produces the hormones okay, T4 is converted into T3 okay, there's no autoimmune attack, but the cells are resistant to thyroid hormone. So it's the end game down the chain that causes the problems. And there we have to look at a number of things, why the cells aren't using thyroid hormone. That can be from, one, T3 is being converted into what's called reverse T3, which is an inactive form of the hormone, typically done for protection mechanisms. We'll see this a lot with chronic stress, high cortisol. We'll see this with infection, mitochondrial dysfunction. So these, you can test reverse T3. That's one of the markers that's on our test to see if that's one of the problems. And also with all of these, they all have their own unique origins. So we still take a root caused approach. We still look at the big picture. Some of the big factors that can influence all of these lines of kind of chains of command, if you will. One, we have to look at nutrient status. So zinc deficiency, selenium deficiency, extremely common, and both of those are needed to convert T4 into T3 and to actually manufacture the hormone itself. Iron levels are another big one. And thank you, Destiny, for that comment. Yeah, I completely understand. Iron is needed to use and manufacture thyroid hormone, as is vitamin D. So when those are low, it also makes me ask, why? Why are those low? Is it from an intake issue where we're not eating foods or getting adequate sources of those nutrients? Or are they all linked? Like, for example, gut health, or maybe we have a higher demand for those nutrients from something that might be going on beneath the surface. In addition, some main things that we look at are gut health, as with everything else. Dysbiosis, these microbes can create chronic inflammation, sources of inflammation that actually damage our thyroid. So there's an infection that can stem from the gut that is very common in people with Hashimoto's. The immune system goes after that bacterium as well as the thyroid itself in a process called molecular mimicry. There's also how those toxins and inflammatory markers affect the mitochondria in the cell, and thereby affecting our gut, our cell's ability to use thyroid hormone. And then lastly, gut health can influence the conversion of T4 to T3. We also need to look at toxicity. Heavy metals are notorious for damaging the thyroid. Thyroid's kind of the canary in the coal mine as it is. But when we look at cadmium and mercury in particular, lead, these can be really damaging to the thyroid. As again, same with the autoimmune component, as well as the cell's utilization of thyroid hormone. And then other hormones. So for example, insulin surges will affect our cell's ability to use thyroid hormone. And this actually becomes a vicious cycle because when there's insulin resistance, when there's hypothyroidism at the cellular level, we also can't use insulin appropriately. So then it starts to further the pre-diabetes or diabetes. So getting one in check will help get the other in check. If both are out of balance, then it will continue to perpetuate the problem. And then also cortisol from chronic stress downregulates all aspects of thyroid hormone. And lastly, I want to mention estrogen in both women and men, but women listening to birth control, estrogen dominance binds up thyroid hormone. So your thyroid can produce it okay, but the estrogen will increase thyroid binding globulin, rendering the hormone not available. So again, that will influence our body's ability to utilize thyroid hormone. So then what do we do? First and foremost, the number of people that I've talked to that have said, oh yeah, like they fit all the symptoms and they're like, oh, my thyroid's fine, my doctor checked it, and they ran TSH. I'm telling you, it's not enough information. It'll help, but the number of times that I've seen TSH in normal range and then we see these gross abnormalities further down the chain are too many times to count. So adequate testing is first and foremost, because then we can really figure out what we're actually dealing with. Is it thyroid in the first place? And if so, where's that chain breaking down? From there, once we get a better idea of where the chain is breaking down, then we can combine your other factors of health. So your personal health history, family health history, review of current concerns, chief complaints, and we can get a better idea of what might be causing that. You know, for one person, it might be, we might immediately look at the gut. For another, for example, hypothyroid patterns, including autoimmune, are really common after pregnancy. So is there another shift that happened during pregnancy? Did other issues come on? How was the pregnancy itself? What does nutrient status look like? What about hormones? So, or, you know, I was just talking with another person who lived in a toxic house, lived in a moldy house. There's a path that we're going to go down. So it really depends on the person as far as what steps we take next. Medication can be helpful. It can be helpful in addressing the symptoms. But as many of people can probably relate to, it doesn't solve the problem. And oftentimes we also create thyroid hormone resistances to the medication. So you constantly have to adjust the dosage and eventually it stops working. And if it's a problem at the cellular level, then again, it's going to stop working faster. If it's a Hashimoto's problem, then the problem is just really going to be aggravated because we're not addressing the immune system. So you really, like for long-term healing, have to look at the bigger picture. What are the true patterns? What's really happening with all of those aspects down the chain of command? Then use an individualized approach to figure out where we go next in order to identify those unique root causes so that we can implement a truly individualized and personalized plan to restore the thyroid long term.